Emma Sullivan clutched the crumpled bank notice in her trembling fingers as snow began to drift past the courthouse windows. 6 months pregnant and desperately alone, she had never imagined she would find herself in Pine Ridge's courthouse on this bitter February morning, preparing to bid on a man's labor like he was cattle at market. The 24-year-old widow pressed her free hand against her swelling belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly as if sensing her anxiety. What she was about to do would shock the entire town, but Emma had run out of choices 3 weeks ago, when the final foreclosure warning arrived. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The man standing on the platform before Judge Hayes was unlike any of the other laborers who had been auctioned off that morning. Jake Morrison stood with his shoulders squared and his chin raised despite his circumstances, dark hair falling across storm-gray eyes that seemed to challenge every person in that room. His clothes were patched but clean, his boots worn but well-maintained, and there was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of pride refusing to be broken by desperation. When the judge announced his reputation for being too wild to manage, Emma saw something flicker across the man's face that looked less like defiance and more like wounded dignity. Emma had never planned to be sitting in that drafty courthouse, listening to Judge Margaret Hayes auction off desperate men to the highest bidders. 3 months earlier, she had been Mrs. Thomas Sullivan, wife to the most skilled logger in Pine Ridge, Colorado, pregnant with their first child together and raising Tommy's daughter Lily from his first marriage. Life had been hard but full of hope, with dreams of expanding their small homestead and watching their family grow beneath the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Then the accident happened. One moment Tommy was climbing a massive pine that had been marked for cutting, his rope secure and his axe sharp, and the next moment Emma was a widow, standing over a fresh grave while the February wind cut through her mourning dress. The other loggers had tried to explain what went wrong, something about a rotted branch and a snapped safety line, but their words had blurred together in her grief. All Emma truly understood was that the man who had promised to love her until his dying breath had kept that promise far too soon. The weeks following the funeral had passed in a haze of condolence visits and awkward conversations with neighbors who seemed more interested in her condition than her grief. Mrs. Dorothy Pierce, the wealthiest woman in Pine Ridge, had made pointed suggestions about Emma moving back east to live with relatives, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a pregnant widow managing a homestead alone. Father Michael O'Connor had offered prayers and platitudes, but no practical solutions when the bills began piling up on Emma's kitchen table. Even Dr. Samuel Brooks, who had been caring for her pregnancy, had gently suggested that perhaps a woman in her delicate condition might be better served by the charity of distant family members. But Emma had no distant family members. Her parents had died in a cholera outbreak when she was 16, and Tommy had been her entire world since she arrived in Pine Ridge as a mail-order bride 4 years ago. The homestead was all she and Lily had left of the man they had both loved, and Emma would be damned if she would let the bank take it away from them. She had tried everything she could think of to raise the money needed to keep their land. She had sold Tommy's tools, his good clothes, even her own wedding ring, but it was not enough. The debt Tommy had accumulated buying their land and building their home was more than a pregnant woman could manage alone. That was how Emma found herself walking into the Pine Ridge courthouse on the second Tuesday of February, desperate enough to consider an option that would have horrified her just months before. The work auctions were held every month during the winter, when jobs were scarce and men were willing to sell their labor for room and board just to survive until spring. Emma had heard about them, but had never imagined she would need to participate. The very idea of bidding on a human being, even temporarily, made her stomach turn, but her options had dwindled to nothing. She had left 8-year-old Lily with their neighbor, Mrs. Chun, telling the little girl only that she had business in town. Lily had looked at her with those serious brown eyes that reminded Emma so much of Tommy, and had asked quietly if they were going to have to leave their home. Emma had knelt down and taken her stepdaughter's small hands in hers, promising that she would do everything in her power to keep them together in the house Tommy had built for them. It was a promise she intended to keep, no matter what it cost. The courthouse was more crowded than Emma had expected. Ranchers and mine owners sat in the front rows, their wives whispering behind gloved hands as they evaluated the men who stood waiting to be auctioned. The workers themselves were a mixture of drifters, failed prospectors, and men who had simply run out of luck in a territory that demanded more strength than many could give. Some looked defeated, others defiant, but all of them had the hollow-eyed look of men who had been pushed to the edge of survival. Emma took a seat near the back, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders and trying to make herself invisible. She felt the weight of curious stares from other women in the room, most of whom knew her by sight, if not by name. Pine Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and a pregnant widow attending a labor auction was bound to cause talk. Emma tried to ignore the whispered conversations and focused on the proceedings, studying each man who was brought forward and trying to determine who might be willing to work her land for the promise of room and board. The first few men were clearly not suitable for her needs. One was too old, his back already bent from years of hard labor. Another was too young, barely more than a boy who looked like he would eat more than he could produce. A third had the shaking hands of a man too familiar with the bottle, and Emma knew she could not risk having someone unreliable around. Lily. She was beginning to wonder if this desperate plan was doomed to failure when Jake Morrison was brought forward. There was something different about this man from the moment he stepped onto the platform. While the others had slouched or fidgeted under the scrutiny of potential buyers, Jake stood perfectly still, his gray eyes sweeping the crowd with a calm assessment that seemed to turn the tables on who was judging whom. Judge Hayes read from a paper in her hand, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Jake Morrison, age 28, formerly employed by Rocky Mountain Logging until last autumn, strong worker, experienced with all manner of construction and land clearing. However, I am obligated to warn potential employers that Mr. Morrison has been difficult to manage in previous positions. He has a reputation for questioning authority and has been involved in several altercations with supervisors. Emma watched Jake's jaw tighten slightly at the judge's words, but he did not speak in his own defense. There was something about his silence that struck her as dignified rather than sullen. She found herself studying his face, noting the intelligence in his eyes, and the way he held himself despite being displayed like goods for sale. When she looked at his hands, she saw they were calloused but clean, the hands of a man who took pride in his work even if others found him troublesome. "Who will start the bidding?" Judge Hayes called out, her voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Silence stretched for long moments. Emma could see the other potential employers exchanging glances and shaking their heads slightly. Clearly, Jake Morrison's reputation had preceded him, and no one wanted to deal with a worker who might cause problems. Emma felt a stirring of sympathy for the man standing alone on the platform, his pride intact but his prospects dwindling with each passing second. "Come now," the judge continued, her tone becoming slightly impatient. "Surely someone can use a strong back for winter work. Mr. Morrison may have his difficulties, but he is known to be an excellent worker when properly motivated." Still, no one spoke. Emma could see the tension in Jake's shoulders, the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She realized that this man was watching his last chance for survival slip away, and something about his quiet dignity in the face of rejection moved her in a way she had not expected. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Emma rose to her feet, Her voice, when she spoke, was clearer and stronger than she had expected. "I'll take him." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread throughout the room. Every head turned toward Emma, and she felt the weight of their stares like a physical thing. She heard Mrs. Pierce's sharp intake of breath, saw the judge's eyebrows rise in surprise, and noticed the way Jake Morrison's gray eyes locked onto hers with an expression of complete astonishment. "Mrs. Sullivan," Judge Hayes said carefully, "are you certain about this? In your condition and with your recent loss, perhaps you should reconsider." Emma lifted her chin, channeling every bit of strength Tommy had always told her she possessed. "I am certain, Your Honor. I have land that needs working and a home that needs maintaining. Mr. Morrison appears to be exactly what I require." The murmur of conversation that erupted throughout the room was like the buzzing of angry bees. Emma could hear fragments of shocked whispers, questions about her judgment and her morality, speculation about what a pregnant widow could possibly want with a man known for being too wild to handle. She ignored them all, keeping her eyes fixed on Judge Hayes while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Very well," the judge said finally, though her tone suggested she thought this was a terrible idea. "The terms are standard room and board, plus a small wage in exchange for labor through the end of April. Mr. Morrison, do you accept employment with Mrs. Sullivan?" Emma found herself holding her breath as she waited for Jake's answer. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, he simply looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to understand what had motivated her unprecedented bid. Then slowly he nodded. "I accept," he said, his voice deep and rough from disuse. The transaction was completed with paperwork and a handshake that felt both formal and surreal. Emma found herself the employer of a man she had never spoken to, someone whose reputation for wildness had scared off every other potential buyer. As she signed her name to the contract, she wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life or the smartest decision she had ever made. As the crowd began to disperse, Emma made her way toward the front of the room where Jake Morrison was gathering his few possessions. He had a worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder and a coat that had seen better years, but his movements were efficient and purposeful. When she approached him, he turned to face her, and Emma was struck by how tall he was, how his presence seemed to fill the space around him. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly, his voice carrying a formality that somehow also held warmth, "I want you to know that I am grateful for this opportunity. I will work hard for you." Emma nodded, suddenly unsure of what to say to this man she had just purchased the services of. "I expect you will, Mr. Morrison. I would not have made the bid otherwise." They stood there for a moment in awkward silence, two strangers bound together by necessity and desperation. Emma was acutely aware of the curious stares still directed their way, of the whispered conversations that would follow them both for weeks to come. But she was also aware of something else, a strange sense of rightness about her decision that she could not explain. "I should warn you," Jake said, his voice so low that only she could hear it. "What they say about me is not entirely untrue. I do not suffer fools gladly, and I have been known to speak my mind when I perhaps should hold my tongue. If you are expecting someone who will simply take orders without question, you may find yourself disappointed." Emma considered this, studying his face as she thought about his words. There was honesty in his admission, a straightforwardness that she found refreshing after weeks of people dancing around difficult truths. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, "I am a pregnant widow who just bid out a man at public auction. I think it is safe to say that I am not particularly concerned with conventional expectations. What I need is someone who will work hard and deal honestly with me. If you can do those things, we will get along fine." Something shifted in Jake's expression, a slight softening around his eyes that might have been surprise or approval. He nodded once, sharply, and Emma had the sense that they had just reached an understanding of sorts. "In that case, Mrs. Sullivan, I believe we have a bargain." The ride back to the homestead was conducted mostly in silence, with Jake sitting in the back of the wagon while Emma handled the reins. The snow had picked up while they were in the courthouse, and the mountain road was becoming treacherous. Emma found herself grateful for Jake's presence when they hit a particularly rough patch, and he quietly moved forward to help steady the wagon without being asked. As they approached the homestead, Emma saw it through fresh eyes, wondering what Jake Morrison would think of the place he would be calling home for the next few months. The house Tommy had built was small but sturdy, constructed of local pine logs with a stone chimney that drew well and windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. The barn needed some repairs to the roof and the fence around the garden. Plot had several broken rails, but overall the property was in decent condition, considering Emma had been managing it alone for 3 months. What struck her most as they pulled up to the house was how quiet everything seemed. When Tommy had been alive, there had always been the sound of his work somewhere on the property, the ring of his axe or the scrape of his saw, the low murmur of his voice as he talked to the animals. Now there was only the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the creak of the wagon wheels as they came to a stop. "This is it," Emma said simply, climbing down from the wagon seat with movements made awkward by her pregnancy. "It is not much, but it is home." Jake stepped down from the wagon bed and stood looking around the property with the same careful assessment he had used on the courthouse crowd. Emma watched him take in the condition of the buildings, the lay of the land, the work that would need to be done to prepare for spring planting. His expression gave nothing away, but she had the impression that he was cataloging every detail. "The barn is where you will be staying," Emma continued, leading him toward the structure in question. Tommy had started converting the tack room into living quarters for a hired hand, though he never finished the work. "There's a stove for heat and a cot, and I can provide blankets and such as you need." The barn was dim and cold, but Jake examined the space without complaint. Emma watched him test the stability of the cot, check the draw on the small stove, and peer through the single window that provided light. Again, his face revealed nothing of his thoughts. "This will do fine," he said finally. "I have slept in worse places." Emma felt a flicker of relief. She had been worried that a man accustomed to logging camps might find the accommodations too rough, but Jake seemed genuinely unbothered by the simple arrangements. "Meals are at sunrise, noon, and sunset," she told him. "I expect you to work from dawn to dusk, with time off on Sundays for church if you are so inclined. The work will vary depending on what needs doing, but right now the most urgent tasks are repairing the barn roof, fixing the garden fence, and splitting enough firewood to last through the rest of winter." Jake nodded, still looking around. "The space that would be his home. And your daughter?" he asked. "I noticed you have a child." "Lily," Emma said, her voice softening at the mention of her stepdaughter. "She is 8 years old and quite well behaved. She may be curious about you at first, but she will not be a bother." "I do not mind children," Jake said quietly. "They tend to be more honest than adults." There was something in the way he said it that made Emma look at him more closely, but before she could ask what he meant, the sound of voices carried across the yard from the direction of the house. Emma turned to see Mrs. Chun approaching with Lily in tow, the older woman's face creased with concern and curiosity. "Emma, dear," Mrs. Chun called out as she drew near, "Lily told me you had gone to town on business. I hope everything went well." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized she would have to explain Jake's presence to her neighbor, and through Mrs. Chun, to the rest of Pine Ridge. She had been so focused on getting through the auction and making it home that she had not fully considered how she would handle the inevitable questions about her decision. "Mrs. Chun, I would like you to meet Mr. Jake Morrison," Emma said, falling back on politeness to buy herself time to think. "He will be working our land through the spring." Mrs. Chun's eyes widened as she took in Jake's appearance and the implications of his presence. Emma could practically see the questions forming in the older woman's mind. But before she could voice them, Lily stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you the man Mama bought?" she asked Jake directly, her brown eyes serious and intent. Emma felt her face flame with embarrassment, but Jake crouched down to Lily's level with a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose I am," he said gravely, "though I prefer to think of it as your mama hiring me to help take care of your home." Lily considered this for a moment, studying Jake's face with the same intensity Emma had noticed in herself earlier. "Can you fix things?" Lily asked finally. "Papa used to fix everything, but since he went to heaven, lots of things have been breaking." Emma felt her throat tighten at her daughter's matter-of-fact reference to Tommy's death, but Jake simply nodded seriously. "I can fix most things," he told Lily. "What needs fixing most?" "The barn roof leaks when it rains," Lily said promptly. "And the gate to the chicken coop does not latch right, so sometimes the chickens get out and Mama has to chase them all over." "Well then," Jake said, rising to his full height, "I suppose I had better get started on those repairs." As Mrs. Chun took her leave with promises to check on Emma soon, and as Lily skipped back toward the house chattering about the chickens, Emma found herself alone with Jake Morrison once again. The reality of what she had done was beginning to sink in, and she felt a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with the baby moving inside her. She had brought a stranger to her home, a man with a reputation for being difficult and unpredictable. She was trusting him around her daughter, in her house, with access to everything she held dear. It was either the bravest thing she had ever done or the most foolish, and only time would tell which it would prove to be. But as she watched Jake Morrison shoulder his bag and head toward the barn to settle into his new quarters, Emma felt something she had not experienced since Tommy's death. A sense that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not entirely alone anymore. The first morning dawned gray and cold, with frost covering every surface like delicate lace. Emma woke before sunrise, as had become her habit since Tommy's death, her body automatically responding to the rhythms of farm life, even when her heart felt too heavy to face another day. She dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, careful not to wake Lily, who was curled beneath thick quilts in the small bedroom they now shared. The house felt different with Jake Morrison sleeping in the barn, as if the very air had shifted to accommodate this stranger's presence on their land. Emma lit the kitchen stove and began preparing breakfast, her movements automatic after years of the same routine. She mixed batter for flapjacks and sliced thick strips of bacon from the side hanging in the root cellar, cooking enough for 3 adults, though she had grown accustomed to barely eating enough to sustain herself and Lily. As she worked, she found herself glancing toward the window that faced the barn, wondering if Jake was awake yet and what his first day of work would reveal about the man she had so impulsively hired. She need not have wondered long. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the mountains, Emma saw Jake emerge from the barn carrying a wooden bucket. He moved with purpose toward the well, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Even from a distance, she could see that he had already been awake for some time, his hair damp as if he had washed in the cold water, his clothes neat despite their worn condition. There was something reassuring about his early rising, a sign that he took his responsibilities seriously despite the unusual circumstances of his employment. By the time Emma had breakfast ready, Jake was standing on the kitchen porch, his hat in his hands and snow brushed from his boots. She opened the door before he could knock, noting how he stood carefully to one side rather than directly in the doorway, as if he understood that entering her home was a privilege rather than a right. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Emma said, stepping back to allow him inside. "I trust you slept well enough." Jake nodded as he entered, his eyes taking in the warm kitchen with its scrubbed wooden table and cheerful yellow curtains. "Well enough. Ma'am. Thank you for asking." Lily appeared in the doorway leading to the bedrooms, her hair tousled from sleep and her nightgown trailing behind her as she padded barefoot across the wooden floor. She stopped short when she saw Jake, suddenly shy in the way children could be when encountering someone new in familiar surroundings. "Good morning, Miss Lily," Jake said gravely, offering her a slight bow that made the little girl giggle despite her shyness. "Lily, go get dressed for the day," Emma instructed gently. "Breakfast will be ready shortly." As Lily scampered back toward the bedroom, Emma busied herself with setting plates on the table, acutely aware of Jake's presence in her kitchen. He stood near the door, clearly uncertain whether he should sit or remain standing, whether he was expected to make conversation or maintain silence. The awkwardness of the situation struck Emma forcefully. The realization that she had brought this man into her home, without any clear understanding of how they would navigate the intimate details of daily life together. "Please sit down," Emma sighed, gesturing toward one of the wooden chairs Tommy had made during their first winter together. "There is no need to stand on ceremony." Jake took the indicated seat, but remained stiff and formal, his hands resting carefully on his knees. Emma served him a generous portion of flapjacks and bacon, noting how his eyes widened slightly at the size of the serving. She wondered when he had last eaten a proper meal and felt a pang of sympathy for the circumstances that had brought him to her doorstep. "This is very kind of you, Mrs. Sullivan," Jake said quietly. "I want you to know that I do not take your generosity for granted." Emma poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs, the rich aroma filling the kitchen with warmth and comfort. "It is not generosity, Mr. Morrison. It is simply practical. I cannot expect you to work effectively if you are not properly fed." They ate in relative silence, with only the soft sounds of cutlery against plates and the occasional crackle from the wood stove to break the quiet. Emma found herself stealing glances at Jake as he ate, noting his careful table manners and the way he seemed to savor every bite. There was something about his quiet appreciation that reminded her of Tommy during their early days together, when good food and a warm home had seemed like miraculous luxuries after the hardships they had both endured. When Lily joined them, dressed in her warmest wool dress and with her hair hastily braided, the atmosphere around the table began to relax. Children, Emma reflected, had a way of making even awkward situations feel more natural, and Lily's chatter about the chickens and her plans for the day helped fill the silence that had stretched between the adults. "Mr. Morrison," Lily said, suddenly looking up from her plate with serious brown eyes, "are you going to fix the barn roof today?" Jake finished chewing thoughtfully before answering. "I thought I might take a look at it first, see exactly what needs to be done. Sometimes the best way to fix something is to understand it properly before you start making changes." "Papa always said that too," Lily replied, and Emma felt her chest tighten at the casual mention of Tommy. "He said you should never start hammering until you know what you are trying to build." "Your papa sounds like he was a wise man," Jake said gently. "He was," Lily agreed with the simple certainty of childhood. "He knew how to fix everything." "Mama says you know how to fix things too." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks at being drawn into the conversation, but Jake simply nodded seriously at Lily's statement. "I know how to fix some things," he said, "but I expect I will learn new things working here, just like your mama will teach me what needs to be done." After breakfast, Emma walked with Jake around the property, showing him the various projects that needed attention. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of more snow. Emma pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as they walked, conscious of Jake's measured pace beside her in the way. He listened intently to everything she told him about the land and its needs. The barn roof, as Lily had mentioned, was indeed in poor condition. Several shingles had blown away during the autumn storms, and Emma could see daylight through gaps that would need to be sealed before the next heavy snowfall. Jake climbed carefully onto the roof despite the frost, Examining the damage with the methodical thoroughness Emma was beginning to recognize as characteristic of his approach to everything. "The underlying structure is sound," he called down to her. "But you are right to be concerned about the leaks. A few more storms like we had last week, and you could have serious damage to anything stored inside." Emma watched him move across the roof with confident steps, noting how he tested each beam before putting his full weight on it. There was something reassuring about his caution, the way he seemed to understand that taking unnecessary risks would serve no one's interests. "I can make the repairs," Jake continued, climbing back down to ground level. "But I will need materials. Shingles, nails, some tar paper for the worst spots. Do you have supplies, or will I need to make a trip to town?" Emma felt her stomach clench at the mention of purchasing supplies. Every expenditure had to be carefully considered now, weighed against their dwindling resources and the approaching deadlines for various debts. But she also knew that protecting the barn was essential if they hoped to maintain the property's value. "There should be some materials left over from when Tommy built the house," she said carefully. "Check the storage area behind the main stalls. If what you need is not there, make a list and we will see what can be managed." Jake nodded, and Emma had the impression that he understood the financial constraints behind her words, even though she had not stated them directly. There was a perceptiveness to his gray eyes that suggested he was accustomed to reading between the lines, to understanding the unspoken pressures that drove people's decisions. They continued their tour of the property, with Emma pointing out the chicken coop with its faulty latch, the garden fence that needed reinforcing, and the woodshed that required additional splitting and stacking before the next cold snap. Listened to everything without comment, but Emma could see him cataloging each task, prioritizing based on urgency and available resources. "The well pump has been acting up as well," Emma added as they completed their circuit of the homestead. "Sometimes it takes several tries to get water flowing, and I worry that it might fail entirely." Jake crouched down beside the pump and worked the handle several times, listening carefully to the sounds it made. Emma watched his face as he examined the mechanism, seeing concentration and understanding in his expression. "The leather washers are probably worn," he said finally. "It is a common problem with pumps this age. I can replace them, but again, it will require a trip to town for parts." Emma nodded, adding pump repairs to the growing list of expenses she would need to somehow manage. The weight of all these necessary improvements pressed down on her like a physical burden, reminding her of how precarious their situation truly was. As if sensing her distress, Jake rose to his feet and brushed dirt from his hands before speaking again. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I understand this arrangement is not easy for you. Having a stranger on your property, depending on someone you barely know. If there is anything I can do to make the situation more comfortable, you need only ask." Emma looked up at him, surprised by his directness and the genuine concern in his voice. She had expected awkwardness, perhaps even resentment from a man forced by circumstances to work for a woman, but Jake's manner suggested only respectful professionalism tinged with something that might have been kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," she said softly. "I appreciate your understanding. This is indeed a difficult time for us, but I believe we can make this arrangement work to everyone's benefit." The rest of the morning passed quickly as Jake began his work on the barn roof. Emma found herself returning to her household tasks with a lighter heart than she had felt in weeks. There was something deeply reassuring about the sounds of productive work coming from the barn, the steady rhythm of hammer against nail that spoke of problems being solved and progress being made. Lily spent much of the morning perched on the porch railing, watching Jake work with the fascination of a child who had been without male presence in her life for too long. Emma noticed how patient Jake was with her questions, how he would pause in his work to explain what he was doing or why he was doing it in a particular way. There was a gentleness to his interactions with the little girl that eased some of Emma's lingering concerns about bringing a stranger into their home. Around midday, Emma prepared a simple lunch of soup and biscuits, calling Jake in from his work on the roof. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with wood shavings in his hair and satisfaction in his eyes, the look of a man who had accomplished something worthwhile. "How goes the repair work?" Emma asked as she ladled soup into bowls. "Better than I expected," Jake replied, washing his hands at the basin near the back door. "The damage was not as extensive as it appeared from the ground. I should have the worst of the leaks sealed by evening, and the remaining work can be completed tomorrow if the weather holds." Emma felt a surge of relief at this news. One major problem being resolved so quickly seemed almost too good to be true after months of watching their situation steadily deteriorate. "That is wonderful news," she said, and meant it. "I had feared it would be a much larger project." Jake took his seat at the table, accepting the bowl of soup with obvious appreciation. Sometimes things look worse than they are when you are viewing them from a position of worry. A closer examination often reveals that the solution is more manageable than first appeared. Emma considered his words as they ate, wondering if he was speaking only about roof repairs or offering a broader observation about life's challenges. There was something about Jake Morrison that suggested depths beneath the surface, an intelligence and thoughtfulness that seemed at odds with his reputation for being difficult to manage. As the afternoon wore on, Emma found herself drawn to the kitchen window that provided a view of Jake's work area. She told herself she was simply monitoring his progress, ensuring that her investment in his labor was being well utilized, but she was honest enough to admit that her interest went beyond mere practicality. There was something compelling about watching a skilled craftsman at work, seeing raw materials transformed through knowledge and effort into something useful and beautiful. Jake worked with an economy of motion that spoke of years of experience, each movement purposeful and precise. Emma noticed how he would pause occasionally to examine his work, checking alignment and making small adjustments before continuing. It was the behavior of a perfectionist, someone who took pride in doing things properly rather than simply getting them done. When Lily grew bored with watching the repairs and wandered off to play with her dolls, Emma found herself alone in the kitchen with her thoughts. The house felt different with Jake's presence on the property, more alive somehow, as if the very walls were responding to the return of masculine energy and purposeful activity. It was not the same feeling she had experienced when Tommy was alive, but it was not entirely unwelcome either. Emma forced herself to focus on her own tasks, mending a tear in one of Lily's dresses and preparing vegetables for the evening meal. But she remained acutely aware of the sounds coming from outside, the reassuring rhythm of productive work that spoke of stability and competence. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Jake appeared once again at the kitchen door. His face flushed from cold and exertion, but wearing an expression of quiet satisfaction. "The emergency repairs are complete," he announced, wiping his feet carefully on the mat before entering. "The roof should hold against any weather we are likely to see before spring." Emma set down her sewing and looked up at him with genuine gratitude. "Mr. Morrison, I cannot tell you how much this means to me, to have one less worry hanging over our heads." Jake waved away her thanks with a slight gesture. "It is what you hired me to do, Mrs. Sullivan. No thanks are necessary." But Emma could see that her appreciation had pleased him, despite his modest response. There was something in his eyes that suggested he had not received much gratitude for his efforts in recent times, and she filed that observation away as another piece of the puzzle that was Jake Morrison. Dinner that evening was more relaxed than breakfast had been, with the successful completion of the roof repairs creating a sense of accomplishment that made conversation flow more easily. Lily regaled them with stories about her doll's adventures, and Jake listened with the same serious attention he might have given to an adult's concerns. Emma found herself studying his face as he interacted with her daughter, noting the genuine interest he showed in Lily's childish concerns. "Mr. Morrison," Lily said during a lull in her chatter, "do you have any children of your own?" Emma felt her breath catch at the unexpected personal question, but Jake answered without hesitation. "No, Miss Lily, I do not. I have never been married or had a family of my own." "Why not?" Lily asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. Emma began to interject, feeling that Lily's questions were becoming too personal, but Jake held up a gentle hand to indicate he did not mind answering. "I suppose I never found the right person to build a family with," he said thoughtfully. "And my work has kept me moving around quite a bit. It is difficult to put down roots when you are always traveling to the next job." "Well, you are not traveling now," Lily observed with 8-year-old logic. "You are staying here with us." "That is true," Jake agreed solemnly. "I am staying here with you, at least for a while." Emma felt something shift in her chest at this exchange, a recognition of how much Lily had missed having a man in her life, someone to answer her questions and pay attention to her concerns. Tommy had been wonderful with his daughter, patient and loving despite the fact that she was not his biological child, and his death had left a void in Lily's life that Emma had been unable to fill. After dinner, as Emma cleaned the dishes and Jake prepared to return to the barn for the night, Lily made an unexpected request. "Mr. Morrison, would you like to see the drawing I made of you fixing the roof?" Jake paused in pulling on his coat, clearly surprised by the offer. "I would be honored to see your drawing, Miss Lily." Lily scampered off to retrieve her sketch pad, returning with a piece of paper covered in childish but recognizable figures. Emma looked over Jake's shoulder as he examined the drawing, noting how Lily had captured him standing on the barn roof with his hammer raised, his face serious with concentration. It was clearly the work of a child, but there was something touching about the care she had taken to include details, like the patches on his jacket and the determined set of his shoulders. "This is excellent work," Jake said seriously, handling the paper as if it were a precious document. "You have a real talent for capturing what you see." Lily beamed at the praise, and Emma felt her heart warm at the genuine pleasure Jake seemed to take in her daughter's artistic efforts. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it spoke to a kindness of character that impressed her more than his skill with hammer and nails. As Jake prepared to leave for the barn, Emma found herself reluctant to let the evening end. There had been something comfortable about having another adult presence in the house, someone to share the small observations and concerns that made up daily life. But she simply wished him good night and watched from the kitchen window as he made his way across the snowy yard to his quarters. That night, as Emma lay in bed listening to the wind whistle around the eaves, she reflected on the unexpected success of Jake Morrison's first day on their property. He had proven himself to be competent, respectful, and surprisingly gentle. With Lily, more importantly, he had brought a sense of stability to their household that Emma had not realized she was craving. For the first time since Tommy's death, Emma fell asleep without lying awake for hours, worrying about all the things that might go wrong. The barn roof was repaired. Jake Morrison seemed to be exactly what she had hoped for in a hired hand, and tomorrow would bring new challenges that no longer seemed quite so overwhelming. Part 3. The second week of Jake's employment brought with it a fierce mountain storm that tested both the repairs he had made and the growing dynamic between the three inhabitants of the Sullivan homestead. Emma woke before dawn to the howling of wind and the rattle of ice against the windows, immediately concerned about whether Jake would be warm enough in the barn and whether his work on the roof would prove adequate against nature's assault. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on her heaviest wool dress and wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders, before venturing into the kitchen to stoke the fire. As she worked to bring warmth back into the house, Emma found herself glancing repeatedly toward the window that faced the barn, looking for signs of light or movement that would indicate Jake was weathering the storm successfully. Her concerns proved unfounded when she spotted a lantern moving across the yard. Jake's tall figure barely visible through the driving snow as he made his way toward the chicken coop. Emma realized he was checking on the animals, ensuring they had adequate shelter and food despite the brutal conditions. It was exactly the kind of responsible behavior she had hoped for, but hardly dared expect from a man she had known for less than 2 weeks. By the time Jake appeared at the kitchen door, his coat and hat white with accumulated snow, Emma had breakfast well underway and the kitchen warm and welcoming. She opened the door to admit him, noting how he stamped his feet thoroughly and brushed snow from his garments before entering her clean space. "Terrible weather," Jake said as he hung his coat near the stove to dry. "But the animals are secure, and I am happy to report that the barn roof is holding perfectly. Not a single leak despite the wind trying its best to find weak spots." Emma felt a surge of relief and gratitude that made her voice warmer than usual. "That is wonderful news. Mr. Morrison, I must admit I was worried about how your repairs would fare in conditions like these." Jake accepted the cup of coffee she offered with hands that were reddened from cold but steady in their movements. "I do not make repairs that will fail at the first real test," he said simply. "When I fix something, it stays fixed." There was quiet pride in his statement, the confidence of a craftsman who understood his abilities and stood behind his work. Emma found herself believing him completely, trusting in a way that surprised her with its intensity. Lily emerged from the bedroom, already dressed for the day, her hair neatly braided and her face bright with excitement at the dramatic weather. She pressed her nose against the kitchen window, watching the snow swirl and dance in patterns that seemed almost alive. "Will we be snowed in?" she asked hopefully, clearly enchanted by the idea of being trapped in their cozy home while the storm raged outside. "Possibly for a day or two," Emma replied, ladling porridge into bowls and adding generous portions of preserved fruit. "But we are well supplied and warm, so there is nothing to worry about." Jake took his customary seat at the table, and Emma noticed how natural his presence had become in their morning routine. Lily chattered excitedly about the storm while the adults ate in comfortable companionship. The kitchen filled with warmth and the sense of being safely sheltered while nature displayed her power outside. "Mr. Morrison," Lily said suddenly, looking up from her bowl with bright eyes, "since we cannot work outside today, would you like to see the rest of the house? Mama has lots of interesting things, and there are pictures of Papa everywhere." Emma felt her breath catch at Lily's innocent suggestion. She had not considered that Jake might be curious about the more personal aspects of their lives, about the traces of Tommy that still filled every room of the house. The idea of showing this comparative stranger through the spaces where she and Tommy had built their life together felt both invasive and somehow necessary. Jake seemed to sense her hesitation. "Only if your mama thinks that would be appropriate," he said gently to Lily. "Some things are private, and we must always respect that." Emma looked at Jake's face, searching for any sign of inappropriate curiosity or pushiness, but found only respectful interest and understanding. She realized that he was leaving the decision entirely to her, prepared to accept whatever boundaries she chose to establish. "I think that would be fine," Emma said finally. "After all, this is your home too, at least for now. You should know your way around properly." After breakfast, with the storm still raging outside and indoor activities the only option, Emma found herself giving Jake Morrison a tour of the house Tommy had built for their family. She started with the main room, pointing out the stone fireplace Tommy had constructed with rocks gathered from their own land, the built-in shelves where he had displayed her few precious books, and the rocking chair he had made for her when he learned she was pregnant. Jake examined everything with the same careful attention he brought to his repair work, running his hands along the smooth wood joinery and admiring the craftsmanship that had gone into every detail. Emma found herself seeing her home through his eyes, recognizing anew the skill and love that Tommy had poured into creating a space that would shelter and nurture his family. "Your husband was a talented carpenter," Jake observed, testing the stability of a hand-hewn table that showed not the slightest wobble despite years of use. "This kind of work requires real knowledge and patience." Emma felt a warm glow of pride at the compliment to Tommy's abilities. He learned from his father, who was a furniture maker back in Ohio. Tommy always said that anything worth building was worth building properly, even if it took longer. They moved through the house slowly, with Lily providing enthusiastic commentary about her favorite features and the memories associated with various objects. Emma showed Jake the bedroom she had shared with Tommy, now converted to accommodate both herself and Lily, and the smaller room that had been intended as a nursery, but now served as storage space filled with Tommy's tools and possessions she could not yet bear to sort through. In every room, photographs of Tommy smiled down from walls and shelves, capturing moments from their brief but happy marriage. Emma watched Jake's face as he took in these images of the man whose place he was temporarily filling, wondering what. He thought about working for the widow of someone who had clearly been beloved and accomplished. "He looks like he was a good man," Jake said quietly, pausing before a photograph that showed Tommy holding baby Lily on his shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. "He was," Emma replied simply, "the best man I have ever known." Jake nodded without comment, and Emma appreciated that he did not try to offer empty platitudes or comparisons. There was something respectful about his silence, an acknowledgement that some losses were too profound for casual words. As they returned to the main room, Lily settled herself by the fire with her dolls, while Emma and Jake found themselves sitting across from each other at the kitchen table. The storm still howling outside, but the house feeling warm and secure around them. For the first time since Jake's arrival, they were truly alone together with no immediate tasks to occupy their attention, and Emma felt a sudden awkwardness about how to fill the time. "Tell me about your work with the logging company," Emma said finally, seeking safe conversational ground. "Lily mentioned that you had difficulties with your supervisors." Jake's expression grew thoughtful, and Emma could see him considering how much to reveal about the circumstances that had led to his dismissal. "I suppose you could say I had philosophical differences with the way the operation was being run," he said carefully. "There were safety concerns that I felt were not being properly addressed, and I was not shy about voicing my opinions." Emma leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite herself. "What kind of safety concerns?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if the answers lay at the bottom. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful memories. "Men were dying unnecessarily," he said simply. "Equipment was not being properly maintained. Safety protocols were being ignored to save time and money. And when accidents happened, the company was more concerned with avoiding liability than preventing future incidents." Emma felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Is that what happened to Tommy? An accident that could have been prevented?" Jake's gray eyes met hers directly, and Emma saw something in them that might have been sorrow or regret. "I do not know the specific details of your husband's accident," he said quietly. "But I do know that Rocky Mountain logging has had more than its share of preventable tragedies. Good men have died because profit was considered more important than proper precautions." Emma felt anger rising in her chest, hot and unexpected after months of numb grief. The idea that Tommy might have died not because of inevitable workplace danger, but because of someone else's carelessness or greed, was almost unbearable. "You were there that day," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "You were working for the same company when Tommy died." Jake nodded slowly, his expression grave. "I was, though I was working a different section of forest. I heard about the accident immediately. By the time I reached the site, it was already too late." Emma stared at him, her mind reeling with the implications of this revelation. Jake Morrison had been present on the day her world fell apart, had possibly known Tommy personally, had witnessed the immediate aftermath of the tragedy that had left her widowed and struggling to survive. "Did you know him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know my husband?" Jake's pause stretched long enough that Emma knew the answer before he spoke. "Yes," he said finally. "I knew Tommy Sullivan. He was a good man and a skilled worker. Everyone respected him." Emma felt tears threatening for the first time in days, overwhelmed by this unexpected connection between her past and present. Here was someone who had known Tommy in the last days of his life, who could perhaps answer questions that had haunted her since the funeral. "What was he like there?" she asked urgently. "Was he happy with his work? Did he talk about us?" Jake's expression softened as he saw her desperate need for these details about Tommy's final weeks. "He talked about you and Lily constantly," Jake said gently. "He was so excited about the baby coming, always planning improvements to the house, and talking about teaching his children to appreciate the mountains. He carried your photograph in his shirt pocket and would show it to anyone who would listen." Emma pressed her hand to her mouth, overcome by the image of Tommy sharing his joy and pride with his fellow workers. It was exactly like him to have made their private happiness into something he wanted to celebrate with the world. "He was planning to leave the logging company after this baby was born," Jake continued, his voice careful and measured. "He had been talking about focusing on carpentry work, maybe starting a furniture-making business that would keep him closer to home. He said he wanted to be there to watch his children grow up." This revelation struck Emma like a physical blow. Tommy had never mentioned leaving the logging company to her, though she had wished many times that he would find work that kept him safer and closer to home. The idea that he had been planning exactly that future, only to have it cut short by the very dangers he was preparing to leave behind, seemed cruelly ironic. "Why did you not tell me this when you first arrived?" Emma asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Jake looked down at his hands, and Emma could see the weight of difficult memories in his posture. "What purpose would it have served?" he asked quietly. "You were grieving and struggling to survive." Adding details about what your husband had planned to do, about conversations you would never have the chance to finish, seemed like it would only increase your pain. Emma considered this, recognizing the kindness in Jake's decision to spare her additional sorrow. But she also felt a flash of anger at having been protected from information that belonged to her. Details about her own husband's thoughts and plans in his final days. "Those details belong to me," she said firmly. "Tommy was my husband, and I have a right to know everything about his last weeks, even if it hurts." Jake nodded, accepting her rebuke without defensiveness. "You are absolutely right. I apologize for making that decision without consulting you. If you want to know more about Tommy's time at the logging camp, I will tell you everything I remember." Emma felt her anger dissipate as quickly as it had arisen, replaced by gratitude for Jake's willingness to be completely honest with her. She realized that his initial decision to withhold information had come from a desire to protect her, not from any attempt to deceive or manipulate. "I do want to know," she said softly. "Not today, perhaps, but sometime soon. I want to know everything about who he was and what he was thinking in those final days." Jake nodded solemnly. "Then I will tell you everything. I promise you that." The rest of the storm-bound day passed more quietly, with this new understanding lying between them like a bridge connecting Emma's past to her present circumstances. Lily played contentedly by the fire, occasionally drawing Jake into conversations about her dolls or asking him to help with a puzzle, while Emma worked on mending clothes and preparing meals. But beneath the domestic tranquility, Emma found herself constantly aware of Jake's presence in a new way. He was no longer simply the desperate man she had hired at auction, but someone who carried memories of Tommy, who had been present during the final chapter of her husband's life. The knowledge created a strange intimacy between them that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with shared connection to the man she had loved. As evening approached and the storm finally began to show signs of abating, Emma realized that her relationship with Jake Morrison had fundamentally changed. He was no longer a stranger working her land, but someone who held pieces of her history, fragments of Tommy's story that she desperately wanted to understand. The shift was both comforting and unsettling, creating a bond that went far deeper than the simple employer-employee relationship she had originally envisioned. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind finally dying down outside, Emma found herself thinking not about the practical concerns that usually occupied her mind, but about the strange workings of fate that had brought Jake Morrison to her doorstep. Of all the men who might have been available at that auction, she had chosen the one person who could tell her about Tommy's final days, who could fill in the gaps in her understanding of her husband's death. It seemed too much of a coincidence to be mere chance, and Emma found herself wondering if perhaps Tommy himself had somehow guided her choice, ensuring that she would find not just a worker for her land, but someone who could help her complete the story of their interrupted life together. Part 4, the revelation of Jake's connection to Tommy, created a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere at the Sullivan homestead. Emma found herself watching Jake with new eyes, seeing not just the competent worker who had proven so valuable to their survival, but a living link to her husband's final days. The knowledge both comforted and unsettled her, creating an intimacy between them that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with shared grief and memory. 3 days after the storm passed, Emma finally found the courage to ask Jake to tell her more about Tommy's time at the logging camp. They were sitting on the front porch in the late afternoon, watching Lily play with the chickens while the mountain air carried the crisp promise of early spring. The mundane setting felt right for such a conversation, ordinary enough to contain extraordinary revelations. "Tell me about the day he died," Emma said quietly, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "I know it is painful, but I need to understand what happened." Jake was silent for so long that Emma began to wonder if he had heard her request. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone who had relived these events many times in his own mind. "It was a Tuesday morning, unseasonably warm for late November," he began. "Tommy was working with a crew on the north slope, taking down some of the larger pines that had been marked for cutting. He was one of the most experienced climbers we had, always careful about his equipment and safety procedures." Emma closed her eyes, picturing Tommy in his work clothes, checking his ropes and harnesses with the methodical care she knew he brought to everything important. "What went wrong?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Jake's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, and Emma could see the tension in his shoulders as he forced himself to continue. "The rope anchor failed," he said simply. "Tommy was about 40 feet up when the hardware gave way. The metal loop that was supposed to secure his safety line to the tree had a hairline crack that no one had noticed during inspection." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. The idea of Tommy falling from such a height, of having those final moments to realize what was happening, was almost unbearable. "Was it quick?" she whispered, needing to know but terrified of the answer. Jake nodded slowly, and Emma saw compassion in his gray eyes as he answered her desperate question. "Yes," he said softly, "it was immediate. Tommy would not have suffered, Mrs. Sullivan. That much I can promise you." Emma pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back the sob that threatened to escape. The confirmation that Tommy's death had been quick provided a small measure of comfort, though it did nothing to ease the larger ache of his absence. "You were the one who found him," Emma said, and it was not a question. She could see the truth in Jake's expression, the weight of that terrible discovery written in the lines around his eyes. "I was working the adjacent section when I heard the other men shouting," Jake confirmed. By the time I reached him, several others were already there, but yes, I was among the first to find him. Emma felt a strange gratitude toward this man, who had been present in Tommy's final moments, who had ensured that her husband had not died alone among strangers. The knowledge created a bond between them that went deeper than employment, deeper than mere acquaintance. "What happened after?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "Did the company investigate? Did anyone try to determine why the equipment failed?" Jake's expression darkened, and Emma saw anger flash in his eyes before. "He controlled it. There was an investigation of sorts," he said carefully. "But the company was more interested in limiting their liability than in finding the truth. They claimed that Tommy had not followed proper safety procedures, that he had somehow caused his own death through carelessness." Emma felt rage surge through her like wildfire. The idea that anyone could suggest Tommy had been careless, that his death was his own fault, was so insulting and wrong that she could barely contain her fury. "That is a lie," she said fiercely. "Tommy was the most careful man I have ever known. He would never take unnecessary risks, especially not when he had a family depending on him." "I know," Jake said quietly. "Everyone who worked with Tommy knew he was meticulous about safety. That is why I spoke up during the investigation, why I told them exactly what I had seen and heard. The equipment failure was obvious to anyone who examined the scene properly." Emma looked at Jake with new understanding, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "That is why you lost your job," she said. "Not because you were difficult to manage, but because you told the truth about what happened to Tommy." Jake nodded grimly. Ben Carter and the other supervisors did not appreciate having their version of events contradicted. When I refused to change my testimony, they made sure I would not find work with any logging operation in the territory. Emma felt a complex mixture of gratitude and guilt wash over her. Jake Morrison had sacrificed his own livelihood to defend Tommy's reputation, to ensure that her husband's death was not blamed on his own supposed negligence. The cost of his integrity had been his career, his ability to earn a living in the only trade he knew. "Why?" Emma asked softly. "Why would you risk everything for a man you barely knew?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of conviction that Emma found deeply moving. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because Tommy Sullivan was a good man who deserved better than to have his death used as a convenient excuse for corporate negligence. And because I knew he had a wife and daughter who would have to live with whatever story the company chose to tell." Emma felt tears streaming down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the realization that this man had stood up for Tommy when it mattered most, had protected his reputation at great personal cost. The knowledge transformed her understanding of Jake Morrison entirely, revealing him not as the difficult troublemaker others had painted him to be, but as a man of principle who was willing to pay any price for his integrity. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate to express the depth of her gratitude. "Thank you for defending him, for making sure the truth was told." Jake reached across the space between their chairs and briefly covered her hand with his own, the gesture gentle and comforting. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I did what any decent man would have done." But Emma knew that was not true. Most men would have kept quiet, would have protected their own interests rather than risk their careers for abstract principles. Jake Morrison was something rarer than he seemed to realize, and Emma felt a profound appreciation for the twist of fate that had brought him to her doorstep. As the days passed following this conversation, Emma found herself seeing Jake with completely different eyes. The quiet competence she had admired from the beginning now seemed like just the surface expression of much deeper qualities. His gentle patience with Lily, his respectful manner toward Emma herself, his dedication to his work, all of these traits took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his sacrifice for Tommy's memory. The practical aspects of their arrangement continued to work smoothly. Jake had moved on from the barn roof repairs to tackle the garden fence, replacing rotted posts and reinforcing weak sections with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to every task. Emma watched him work from the kitchen window, noting how he took time to explain his methods to Lily when she peppered him with questions, never showing impatience with her curiosity. But beyond the practical benefits of Jake's presence, Emma was becoming aware of more subtle changes in the atmosphere of their home. The house no longer felt empty and echoing as it had since Tommy's death. There were sounds of purposeful activity, the comfort of another adult presence, the security that came from knowing she was not facing the challenges of homestead life entirely alone. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table after supper, Lily made an observation that struck Emma with unexpected force. "Mr. Morrison," the little girl said, looking up from the wooden horse he had carved for her during a rainy afternoon, "you make our house feel like a family again." Emma felt her breath catch at Lily's innocent words, at the child's recognition of something Emma herself had been reluctant to acknowledge. They had indeed begun to feel like a family of sorts. This unlikely trio brought together by necessity and circumstance, but bound by something deeper than mere convenience. Jake's response to Lily's comment was characteristically gentle and thoughtful. "That is very kind of you to say, Miss Lily," he replied. "I am grateful to be welcomed into your home." But Emma caught something in his expression, a flicker of longing or sadness that suggested Lily's words had touched something deep within him. She realized that Jake Morrison was as much in need of family and belonging as they were, that his presence in their home was filling a void in his own life, as well as theirs. The realization created a new dynamic between Emma and Jake, an unspoken recognition that their arrangement had evolved beyond a simple business transaction into something more complex and meaningful. They were not just employer and employee, not just landlady and tenant, but three people who had found in each other something essential that had been missing from their individual lives. This growing sense of connection manifested itself in small but significant ways. Emma began to cook meals that took Jake's preferences into account, noticing that he particularly enjoyed her apple pie and that he always complimented her biscuits. Jake, in turn, began to anticipate household needs before Emma had to ask, bringing in extra firewood before storms, checking on the animals without being reminded, finding and fixing small problems before they became larger ones. Most tellingly, their conversations began to range beyond the practical matters of daily life into more personal territory. Jake shared stories of his childhood in the mountains, raised by his Cherokee grandmother after his parents died in a smallpox epidemic. Emma found herself talking about her dreams for the future, her hopes for the child she carried, her plans for expanding the homestead if their finances ever allowed. These exchanges created an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance, but everything to do with genuine friendship and mutual respect. Emma had not realized how much she had missed having another adult to talk to, someone who could appreciate her concerns and share her burdens. The friendship that was developing between them did not go unnoticed by the residents of Pine Ridge. Mrs. Pierce made increasingly frequent visits, her eyes sharp with curiosity and disapproval as she observed the easy familiarity between Emma and Jake. Other neighbors began to offer subtle comments about the unusual arrangement at the Sullivan homestead, questions disguised as concern about Emma's reputation and welfare. Emma found herself torn between irritation at the gossip and genuine concern about how the talk might affect Lily. She did not want her daughter to suffer socially because of choices Emma had made out of necessity, but she also refused to be dictated to by people who had offered no practical help during her darkest hours. The tension came to a head one Sunday after church, when Mrs. Pierce cornered Emma in the churchyard while Jake was helping Lily feed the pastor's chickens. "Emma, dear," Mrs. Pierce said, her voice heavy with false sympathy, "I feel I must speak plainly. People are beginning to talk about your living arrangements, and I fear the gossip may damage your reputation permanently." Emma felt her spine stiffen at the older woman's presumptuous tone. "My living arrangements are perfectly proper, Mrs. Pierce. Mr. Morrison has his own quarters in the barn, and he has behaved with complete respectability since the day he arrived." Mrs. Pierce's expression suggested she found Emma's defense naive. "I am sure he has been perfectly polite, dear. But appearances matter, especially for a woman in your delicate condition. A pregnant widow living alone with an unmarried man, regardless of the sleeping arrangements, invites speculation." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger at the implication that there was anything improper about her friendship with Jake Morrison. "Mr. Morrison is my employee," Emma said firmly. "He is helping me maintain my property and prepare for spring planting. There is nothing scandalous about a woman hiring help to manage tasks that are beyond her physical capabilities." But even as Emma defended her choices, she was aware that Mrs. Pierce's concerns were not entirely without foundation. The easy familiarity that had developed between herself and Jake, the sense of family that Lily had recognized, could indeed be misinterpreted by people who were looking for reasons to gossip. Mrs. Pierce seemed to sense Emma's uncertainty. "Of course, dear, I know your intentions are pure. But intention and appearance are not always the same thing. Perhaps it would be wise to consider alternative arrangements before the talk becomes too widespread." Emma felt a surge of protective anger at the suggestion that she should send Jake away to appease gossiping neighbors. The man had proven himself invaluable not just as a worker, but as a stabilizing presence in their lives. The idea of returning to the isolation and overwhelming responsibility she had faced before his arrival was almost unbearable. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Pierce," Emma said with as much politeness as she could muster, "but I am quite capable of managing my own affairs. Mr. Morrison will remain in my employ as long as his services are needed." Mrs. Pierce's lips pursed with disapproval, but before she could respond further, Jake appeared at Emma's side with Lily in tow. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation, his tall frame and steady gaze causing Mrs. Pierce to step back slightly. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Sullivan?" Jake asked quietly, though Emma could see that he had assessed the situation accurately and understood exactly what kind of conversation had been taking place. "Everything is fine, Mr. Morrison," Emma replied, grateful for his supportive presence. "Mrs. Pierce was just expressing some concerns about our household arrangements." Jake nodded politely to Mrs. Pierce, his manner respectful but cool. "Ma'am," he said simply, offering no explanation or justification for his presence at the Sullivan homestead. Mrs. Pierce clearly recognized that she had lost the advantage in the conversation. "Well," she said with forced brightness, "I suppose I should be getting home. Good day, Emma, Mr. Morrison." As Mrs. Pierce walked away, Emma felt both relief and apprehension. She had stood her ground in defending Jake and their arrangement, but she was also aware that the confrontation had probably not ended the gossip, but merely redirected it. "I am sorry you had to endure that," Jake said quietly once Mrs. Pierce was out of earshot. "I know my presence here creates difficulties for you that you should not have to face." Emma looked up at him, seeing genuine concern in his gray eyes, and recognizing that he was prepared to leave if his presence was causing her more harm than good. "Mr. Morrison," she said firmly, "you have been nothing but helpful and respectful since the day you arrived. If people choose to find fault with that, the problem lies with them, not with us." Jake studied her face for a long moment, and Emma had the sense that he was measuring her resolve, determining whether her words reflected genuine conviction or mere politeness. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Because I would not want Lily to suffer socially because of my presence here." Emma felt her heart warm at his concern for Lily's welfare, at the way he had come to care about her daughter's happiness and security. "I am certain," she said. "You have become part of our family, Mr. Morrison, and families do not abandon each other because of gossip. Something shifted in Jake's expression at her words, a softening around his eyes that might have been gratitude or relief. Emma realized that he had been prepared to leave if necessary, to sacrifice his own security for their reputation, and the knowledge of his willingness to make such a sacrifice only strengthened her resolve to keep him exactly where he was. Part 4. The confrontation with Mrs. Pierce marked a turning point in Emma's relationship with the community of Pine Ridge. Word of her defiant stance spread quickly through the small town, dividing opinion between those who admired her independence and those who were scandalized by her refusal to conform to conventional expectations. Emma found herself the subject of intense scrutiny whenever she appeared in public. Every gesture and expression analyzed for evidence to support one interpretation or another of her character. The division in community opinion became most apparent during her weekly trips to town for supplies. Mr. Henderson at the general store continued to serve her with his usual courtesy, even going so far as to set aside items he thought she might need and offering credit when her funds ran low. But Mrs. Garrett at the bakery made pointed comments about certain people who brought shame upon themselves through poor choices, and the banker Mr. Williams had begun to treat Emma with a cool formality that had not been present before Jake's arrival. Emma bore these slights with as much dignity as she could muster, but she was increasingly aware that her decision to keep Jake in her employ was affecting more than just her own social standing. Lily had begun to come home from school with stories about children whispering and pointing, about invitations to play that were suddenly withdrawn, about friendships that seemed to be cooling for reasons the 8-year-old could not understand. The situation troubled Emma deeply, not for her own sake but for Lily's. The little girl had already endured the loss of her father and the upheaval of their reduced circumstances. Emma could not bear the thought that her choices were adding social isolation to her daughter's burdens. These concerns weighed heavily on Emma's mind as she went about her daily tasks, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety that she tried to hide from both Jake and Lily. She found herself second-guessing decisions she had felt confident about just weeks earlier, wondering if she was being selfish in prioritizing her own needs and comfort over her daughter's social welfare. The internal conflict came to a head one afternoon when Emma was working in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for supper while Jake repaired a loose floorboard in the main room. The domestic scene felt peaceful and right, but Emma's mind was churning with doubts and fears about the future. Jake seemed to sense her distress because he set down his tools and joined her at the kitchen table, his expression concerned and attentive. "Something is troubling you," he observed quietly. "Would it help to talk about it?" Emma paused in her work, considering whether to burden Jake with her concerns. Part of her wanted to keep her doubts private, to avoid making him feel responsible for problems that were ultimately her own to solve. But another part of her craved the comfort of sharing her worries with someone who might understand. "It is the gossip," she admitted finally. "Not for my own sake, but for Lily's. She is beginning to feel the effects of people's disapproval, and I cannot bear the thought that my choices are making her life more difficult." Jake listened without interruption as Emma explained the subtle but unmistakable signs of social ostracism that were affecting her daughter. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful and grave. "I have been afraid this would happen," he said finally. "Small communities can be unforgiving when someone steps outside accepted boundaries, and children often bear the brunt of adult disapproval." Emma felt tears threaten at the confirmation of her fears. "What should I do?" "I cannot send you away. Now, not when we depend on you so much, but I also cannot allow Lily to suffer for my decisions." Jake reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, the gesture warm and reassuring. "You are not responsible for other people's narrow-mindedness," he said firmly, "and you should not have to choose between your family's welfare and social acceptance." Emma looked up at him, seeing determination in his gray eyes along with something deeper that might have been affection or protectiveness. "But what alternative is there?" she asked. "People will talk regardless of what we do now. The damage to our reputation may already be irreversible." Jake was quiet for several minutes, and Emma could see him thinking through possibilities, weighing options with the same methodical approach he brought to his repair work. "There is one solution that would silence the gossip permanently," he said finally, his voice careful and measured. Emma waited for him to continue, sensing that whatever he was about to propose would be significant. "We could marry," Jake said simply. "Not for romance or passion, but as a practical arrangement that would protect both you and Lily from social censure." Emma felt her breath catch at the unexpected suggestion. The idea of marriage to Jake Morrison had not occurred to her, despite the growing closeness between them and the family-like dynamic that had developed in their household. "Marriage," she repeated, testing the word and trying to process its implications. Jake seemed to interpret her surprise as reluctance. "I know it is not an ideal solution," he said quickly. "I am not the husband you would have chosen under different circumstances. But it would legitimize our living arrangement, give you the legal protections of a married woman, and ensure that Lily grows up with a father figure who cares about her welfare." Emma studied Jake's face, looking for signs of his true feelings about this proposal. She could see sincerity in his expression, genuine concern for her and Lily's welfare, but she was not certain whether his offer sprang from duty, affection, or simple practicality. "What would you gain from such an arrangement?" she asked quietly. "You would be taking on responsibility for a pregnant woman and her child, accepting all the burdens of family life without any of the usual reasons men seek marriage." Jake's expression grew thoughtful, and Emma sensed that he was considering how much truth to reveal about his own motivations. "I would gain a home," he said finally. "A place where I belong, people who care whether I come home safely at night. I have been alone for a very long time, Mrs. Sullivan, and these past weeks with you and Lily have shown me what I have been missing." Emma felt something shift in her chest at his admission, a recognition of the loneliness that lay beneath Jake's competent exterior. She realized that their arrangement had been beneficial for him as well as for her family, that he had found in their household something he needed as much as they needed his practical help. "It would not be a real marriage," Emma said slowly, thinking through the implications. "Not in all the ways that matter. I am not ready for that kind of relationship with anyone, may never be ready again." Jake nodded understanding. "I would not expect intimacy beyond what you were comfortable offering. We could have separate bedrooms, maintain whatever boundaries you felt necessary. The marriage would be for legal and social purposes, nothing more." Emma considered the proposal with the same careful deliberation she might give to any other important business decision. Marriage to Jake would indeed solve their immediate social problems, would give Lily the security of a two-parent household, would ensure Emma's legal rights and financial stability. It would also formalize the partnership that had already developed between them, acknowledging the reality of their interdependence. But marriage, even a practical one, was not a decision to be made lightly. Emma needed time to think through all the ramifications, to consider alternatives, to be certain that she was not simply trading one set of problems for another. "I need time to consider your proposal," she said finally. "It is generous and practical, but marriage is not something I can decide impulsively." Jake nodded immediately. "Of course. Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open regardless of how long you need to think about it." That evening, after Jake had returned to the barn and Lily was asleep, Emma sat by the fire considering the unexpected turn her life had taken. Just months ago, she had been a grieving widow with no prospects beyond gradual destitution. Now she was contemplating marriage to a man she had met at a labor auction, a man who had known her beloved Tommy and who had sacrificed his own career to defend her husband's reputation. The more Emma thought about Jake's proposal, the more sensible it seemed from a practical standpoint. He had already proven himself to be reliable, hardworking, and genuinely caring toward both her and Lily. They worked well together, shared similar values, and had developed the kind of easy companionship that many married couples never achieved. But Emma was also aware that accepting Jake's proposal would mean forever closing the door on the possibility of marrying for love again. She had been deeply happy in her marriage to Tommy, had experienced the joy of being cherished and desired by a man who saw her as his partner in all things. A practical marriage to Jake, no matter how sensible, would never offer that kind of emotional fulfillment. Yet as Emma sat in the quiet house, listening to the sounds of night settling over their mountain valley, she found herself questioning whether romantic love was something she truly wanted to pursue again. The pain of losing Tommy had been so devastating that the idea of opening her heart to that kind of vulnerability again felt almost impossible to contemplate. Perhaps a practical marriage based on mutual respect and genuine affection was exactly what she needed. A relationship that offered companionship and security without the risks that came with passionate love. Jake Morrison might not be able to offer her the consuming romance she had shared with Tommy, but he could give her something equally valuable: stability, partnership, and the assurance that she would never again face life's challenges entirely alone. As the fire burned low and shadows lengthened across the room, Emma found herself moving toward a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Jake Morrison's proposal offered a solution to problems that had seemed insurmountable, a way to protect Lily's future while securing her own. More than that, it offered the chance to build something meaningful with a man who had already proven his worth through actions rather than words. Emma rose from her chair and walked to the window that faced the barn, seeing a faint light still burning in Jake's quarters. She wondered if he was lying awake thinking about his proposal, questioning the wisdom of offering to bind his life to hers, or if he was sleeping peacefully with the confidence of a man who had made a generous offer and could wait patiently for her response. Tomorrow, Emma decided she would give Jake Morrison her answer, and unless her heart changed dramatically overnight, that answer would be yes. Part 5. Emma woke the next morning with a sense of anticipation mixed with nervousness that made her stomach flutter in ways that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. She had spent much of the night thinking about Jake's proposal, examining it from every possible angle, and each consideration had reinforced her growing conviction that marriage to him was not just practical but right. She dressed with unusual care, choosing her best remaining dress and braiding her hair with extra attention to neatness. If she was going to accept a proposal of marriage, she wanted to look like a woman worthy of such an offer, even if the proposal itself was more practical than romantic. Jake appeared at the kitchen door at his usual time, but Emma noticed a tension in his shoulders that suggested he had slept no better than she had. He accepted his morning coffee with quiet thanks, but his gray eyes kept drifting to her face, as if trying to read her decision in her expression. Lily chattered through breakfast about a bird's nest she had discovered near the chicken coop, oblivious to the undercurrent of anticipation that ran between the adults at the table. Emma found herself studying the domestic scene with new eyes, imagining how it might feel to make this arrangement permanent, to know that Jake would be part of their lives, not just through this spring, but for years to come. After Lily finished eating and ran outside to check on her chickens, Emma found herself alone with Jake for the first time since his proposal. The kitchen suddenly felt charged with possibility, every ordinary object somehow more significant because of the decision that hung between them. "Mr. Morrison," Emma began, then stopped and corrected herself. "Jake, I have considered your proposal very carefully." Jake set down his coffee cup and gave her his full attention, his expression carefully neutral despite the intensity in his gray eyes. "I accept," Emma said simply. The words fell into the silence between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of change that would affect every aspect of their future lives. Jake's expression shifted from careful control to something that might have been relief or joy, though he quickly schooled his features back to their usual calm. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Marriage is not a decision that can be easily undone if you change your mind." Emma nodded, feeling more confident with each word she spoke. "I am certain. You are right that it solves our practical problems, but more than that, it feels right. We work well together, we care about each other's welfare, and Lily needs the stability that a two-parent household can provide." Jake reached across the table and took her hand in both of his touch warm and reassuring. "I promise you will not regret this decision," he said earnestly. "I will do everything in my power to be a good husband to you and a good father to Lily." Emma felt tears threaten at the sincere emotion in his voice. "I know you will. You have already proven yourself to be more than I could have hoped for when I hired you at that auction." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, hands clasped across the table, both of them adjusting to the magnitude of the decision they had just made. Emma realized that despite the practical nature of their arrangement, she felt genuinely happy about the prospect of marrying Jake Morrison. He had become essential to her daily life in ways that went far beyond his skills as a worker, and the idea of making that relationship permanent brought her a sense of security and contentment she had not expected to feel again. "When should we have the ceremony?" Emma asked, practical considerations asserting themselves as the initial emotion of the moment settled. Jake considered the question thoughtfully. "Soon, I think. The longer we wait, the more opportunity there will be for gossip to damage Lily's social standing. And there are practical benefits to being legally married before the baby arrives." Emma nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his reasoning. "Father O'Connor could perform the ceremony this Sunday after regular services, if you think that would be appropriate." "That sounds perfect," Jake agreed. "Should we tell Lily about our plans, or wait until closer to the ceremony?" Emma thought about her daughter's likely reaction to the news that Jake would be joining their family permanently. Lily had already grown fond of him, had begun to rely on his presence and attention in ways that suggested she would welcome him as a stepfather. "I think we should tell her today," Emma decided. "She deserves to know what is happening, and I believe she will be happy about the news." They found Lily in the chicken yard, carefully collecting eggs in her small wicker basket and chattering to the hens about their laying habits. She looked up with bright eyes when Emma and Jake approached together, immediately sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Lily, sweetie, Mr. Morrison and I have something important to tell you," Emma began, settling onto the wooden bench Jake had built near the chicken coop. Lily set down her basket and climbed onto Emma's lap, her small face serious with attention. "Mr. Morrison has asked me to marry him," Emma continued gently, "and I have said yes. That means he will become your new papa, if you would like that." Lily's eyes widened with delight, and she turned to look at Jake with an expression of pure joy. "Really?" she asked breathlessly. "You would be my papa forever?" Jake knelt down so that he was at eye level with the little girl, his expression tender and sincere. "If you would like me to be," he said softly. "I would be honored to be your papa, Lily. I promise to take good care of you and your mama always." Lily launched herself from Emma's lap into Jake's arms, hugging him with the unreserved enthusiasm of childhood. Emma felt her heart swell with emotion as she watched Jake embrace her daughter, seeing the genuine affection that had developed between them over the past weeks. "Will you teach me to carve wood like you do?" Lily asked eagerly. "And will you help me build a house for my dolls?" Jake laughed, the sound warm and happy in the crisp morning air. "I will teach you anything you want to learn, little one. We will have lots of time for projects together." Emma watched this exchange with deep satisfaction, knowing that she had made the right decision for all of them. Jake Morrison would be a good father to Lily, patient and kind and genuinely interested in her development and happiness. The little girl deserved that kind of stable, loving presence in her life, especially as she faced the adjustment of having a new sibling. The rest of the day passed in a blur of practical preparations and emotional adjustments. Emma found herself looking at their home with new eyes, imagining how it would feel to share it permanently with Jake as her husband rather than her employee. The bedroom situation would need to be rearranged, with Jake moving from the barn into the house but maintaining separate sleeping quarters as they had agreed. They decided that Jake would take the small room that had been intended as a nursery, while Emma and Lily would continue to share the main bedroom until after the baby was born. The arrangement felt comfortable and appropriate, maintaining the boundaries Emma needed while acknowledging the new status of their relationship. Word of their engagement spread through Pine Ridge with the speed of wildfire, carried by Mrs. Chun, who had heard the news from Lily during an afternoon visit. The reaction was everything Emma had hoped for, transforming overnight from scandal to conventional respectability. Mrs. Pierce actually smiled when she encountered Emma at the general store, offering congratulations and commenting on how sensible the arrangement was for everyone involved. Father O'Connor was delighted to perform the ceremony, praising Emma for finding such a practical solution to her difficulties and welcoming Jake into the parish community with genuine warmth. Even the banker, Mr. Williams, began treating Emma with renewed courtesy, clearly relieved that her social status was about to be regularized through marriage. The wedding itself was simple but meaningful, held in the small church with only a few close neighbors as witnesses. Emma wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that complemented her eyes and accommodated her expanding figure with dignity. Jake had purchased new clothes for the occasion, and Emma was struck by how handsome he looked in his dark suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed and his face bright with happiness. Lily served as their only attendant, wearing a yellow dress that Emma had sewn specially for the occasion and carrying a small bouquet of early wildflowers that Jake had helped her gather that morning. The little girl glowed with excitement throughout the ceremony, clearly thrilled to be gaining a father and to be part of something so important and grown-up. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, but Emma found herself meaning every word despite the practical nature of their arrangement. She promised to love, honor, and cherish Jake Morrison, and as she spoke the words, she realized that they were not merely ceremonial, but reflected the genuine affection and respect she had developed for this man who had become so essential to her life. Jake's voice was steady and sure as he made his own promises, his gray eyes never leaving Emma's face as he vowed to protect and care for her and Lily for as long as they all lived. When Father O'Connor pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss was gentle and respectful, a seal on their partnership rather than a declaration of passion. After the ceremony, they returned to their homestead for a simple wedding dinner that Emma had prepared that morning. The house felt different as they crossed the threshold together, transformed from a temporary arrangement into a permanent home by the simple act of speaking vows in front of witnesses. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing stories and laughter while Lily played with her dolls nearby, Emma reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. Less than 2 months ago, she had been a desperate widow bidding on a stranger at a labor auction. Now she was Mrs. Jake Morrison, part of a family that felt as real and meaningful as any she had ever known. Jake caught her eye across the table and smiled, and Emma saw in his expression the same sense of wonder and gratitude that she felt herself. They had both found something unexpected in this practical arrangement, something that went deeper than convenience or social respectability. As night fell and they prepared to begin their new life as a married couple, Emma felt a peace and contentment that she had not experienced since Tommy's death. The future still held uncertainties and challenges, but she would not face them alone. She had a partner now, a man who had already proven his worth through actions rather than words, and together they would build something strong and lasting for their growing family. The first month of marriage brought a gentle settling into new rhythms that felt both foreign and familiar to Emma. Jake had moved his few possessions into the small room off the main living area, transforming the space from storage into living quarters with the same methodical care he brought to all his endeavors. Emma found herself adjusting to the sounds of another adult moving through the house in the early morning hours, the quiet creak of floorboards and the soft closing of doors. That spoke of someone trying not to disturb the rest of the household. Their relationship as husband and wife maintained the respectful boundaries they had established, but Emma noticed subtle changes in their daily interactions that spoke to their new status. Jake no longer hesitated before entering rooms where she was working, no longer asked permission for small domestic decisions like lighting the fire or moving furniture. There was an ease to his presence that came from belonging rather than employment, from being family rather than hired help. Emma's pregnancy had progressed into its 8th month, her body growing heavy and unwieldy as the baby seemed to run out of room beneath her ribs. Jake had taken over all the physically demanding chores without being asked, splitting wood and hauling water with the same quiet efficiency he had always shown, but now with the added motivation of protecting his wife rather than simply earning his keep. He had also begun preparing for the baby's arrival with a thoroughness that touched Emma deeply. The small room that had once been intended as a nursery was cleaned and reorganized, with Jake building a sturdy cradle from pine boards he had carefully selected and seasoned. Emma would often find him in the evenings working on tiny wooden toys, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he carved miniature horses and birds that would someday delight their child. Lily had blossomed under Jake's patient attention, her natural curiosity finding an outlet in his willingness to explain everything from the migration patterns of birds to the best techniques for splitting kindling. She had begun calling him Papa without any prompting from the adults, the transition from Mr. Morrison to family member as natural as breathing. Emma watched their relationship develop with deep satisfaction, knowing that her daughter was gaining not just a father figure but a true mentor who valued her intelligence and encouraged her questions. The spring planting season had arrived with its usual demands, but this year Emma could watch from the porch as Jake prepared the garden beds and sowed the seeds that would feed them through the coming winter. His experience as a logger had given him knowledge of soil and growing seasons that complemented Emma's own understanding of their particular land, and together they had planned a more ambitious garden than she had dared attempt in previous years. The community's acceptance of their marriage had been complete and immediate, validating Emma's decision to prioritize practical considerations over romantic ideals. Mrs. Pierce now treated Emma with the deference to a respectably married woman, and the banker Mr. Williams had even suggested that Jake might be interested in taking on carpentry projects for other residents of Pine Ridge. The social isolation that had threatened to engulf their family had been replaced by genuine integration into the community's fabric. But it was during a particularly warm afternoon in late April, as Emma sat on the porch watching Jake teach Lily how to identify different types of wood grain, that their peaceful new life was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. A lone rider approached from the direction of town, his horse moving with the purposeful gait of someone on important business rather than a casual traveler. Emma recognized Dr. Brooks before he dismounted, his familiar black bag and kind face immediately identifiable even at a distance. But there was something in his expression as he approached the porch that set Emma's nerves on edge, a gravity that suggested this was not a routine social call or pregnancy check. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Brooks said, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "I hope I am not intruding, but I have some news that I felt you should hear immediately." Jake appeared at Emma's side, alerted by the serious tone in the doctor's voice. His presence provided immediate comfort, a solid wall of support that Emma found herself leaning into as Dr. Brooks continued. "There has been a development regarding your first husband's death," the doctor said carefully. "Ben Carter has been arrested on charges of criminal negligence and fraud. It appears that the investigation into the logging company's safety practices has revealed some very disturbing information." Emma felt her heart begin to race, her hands instinctively moving to protect the baby that seemed to shift restlessly. In response to her emotional distress, Jake's hand found her shoulder, steady and reassuring as Dr. Brooks continued his explanation. The federal investigators discovered that Carter and several other supervisors had been systematically falsifying safety reports, using substandard equipment and covering up accidents to protect company profits. "Your husband's death was not an isolated incident, Mrs. Morrison. There have been at least 6 other fatalities that can be directly attributed to their negligence." Emma felt rage and grief war in her chest, the knowledge that Tommy had died not through fate or accident, but through someone else's criminal greed, almost too overwhelming to process. Jake's hand tightened on her shoulder, and she could feel the tension radiating from his body as he absorbed the implications of Dr. Brooks' news. "There is more," the doctor continued gently. "The investigators want to speak with anyone who witnessed the aftermath of your husband's accident or who can testify about the company's safety practices. Your current husband's testimony was instrumental in building their case, Mrs. Morrison. Without his willingness to come forward initially, none of this would have come to light." Emma turned to look at Jake, seeing in his face a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The sacrifice he had made in defending Tommy's reputation had borne fruit in ways none of them could have anticipated, leading to justice not just for Tommy but for all the other men who had died because of Carter's greed. "Will there be a trial?" Emma asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Dr. Brooks nodded gravely. "Most likely, yes. And you may be called to testify about the financial impact of your husband's death, about the circumstances you found yourself in afterward. It will not be easy, but it could result in significant compensation for you and the other widows." The idea of financial compensation felt strange and almost irrelevant to Emma. No amount of money could restore Tommy to life or undo the months of struggle and fear she had endured after his death. But she also recognized that justice demanded accountability, that other families deserved protection from the kind of tragedy that had devastated her own life. After Dr. Brooks departed with promises to keep them informed of further developments, Emma and Jake sat together on the porch, in contemplative silence. Lily had wandered off to tend to her chickens, leaving the adults alone with the weight of these unexpected revelations. "How do you feel about testifying?" Jake asked quietly, his voice carefully neutral despite the concern in his eyes. Emma considered the question, examining her own emotions with the same thoroughness she had once applied to household accounts. "Frightened," she admitted, "but also relieved, I suppose. The idea that Tommy's death meant something, that it might prevent other families from suffering as we have suffered, makes the pain feel less senseless." Jake nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "The trial will be difficult. Carter's lawyers will try to discredit anyone who testifies against him, will attempt to paint the victims as careless or incompetent. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" Emma felt a surge of fierce determination at the thought of anyone attempting to malign Tommy's memory or competence. "Let them try," she said firmly. "I know what kind of man my husband was, and so do you. Anyone who worked with Tommy Sullivan knows that he was the most careful and skilled logger in the territory. No lawyer's tricks can change that truth." Jake's expression warmed with admiration for her resolve. "Then we will face whatever comes together. You will not have to endure this alone." The weeks that followed brought a parade of investigators, lawyers, and court officials to the Sullivan homestead. Emma found herself recounting the details of Tommy's death and its aftermath more times than she could count, each telling slightly easier than the last but never completely painless. Jake proved invaluable during these sessions, his firsthand knowledge of the logging industry, and his witness testimony, providing crucial support for Emma's own account. As her pregnancy neared its end, Emma felt the baby's increasing restlessness, as if the child could sense the emotional turbulence surrounding its impending arrival. Dr. Brooks had assured her that the stress of the legal proceedings would not harm the baby, but Emma could not shake the feeling that her unborn child was absorbing every conversation about death and justice, every moment of anger and grief that the case brought to the surface. It was during one of these difficult days, as Emma struggled with the physical discomfort of late pregnancy and the emotional weight of reliving Tommy's death, that Jake made an observation that would change everything. "Emma," he said quietly, as they prepared for bed one evening, "there is something I need to tell you about the day Tommy died. Something I have not mentioned because I was not certain it was important." Emma felt her heart skip a beat at the serious tone in Jake's voice. They had discussed Tommy's death in exhaustive detail during the preparation for the trial, and she could not imagine what additional information Jake might have withheld. "What is it?" she asked, settling carefully onto the edge of their bed as Jake took the chair by the window. Jake was quiet for so long that Emma began to wonder if he had changed his mind about sharing whatever weighed on his conscience. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a strange mixture of pain and wonder. "When I reached Tommy after the fall, he was still conscious for a few moments," Jake said slowly. "He knew he was dying, could feel that his injuries were too severe to survive. But instead of thinking about himself, all he could talk about was you and Lily and the baby you were carrying." Emma felt tears begin to flow, her heart breaking anew at the image of Tommy's final moments, being consumed with worry for his family, rather than fear for himself. "He made me promise something," Jake continued, his eyes fixed on his hands as if he could not bear to meet Emma's gaze. "He made me swear that I would find you, that I would make sure you and the children were taken care of," he said. Jake's voice broke slightly before he could continue. "He said that if anything ever happened to him, he wanted someone to tell his unborn child how much they were loved." Emma's breath caught in her throat as the implications of Jake's words began to sink in. The coincidence of Jake appearing at the labor auction just when she needed help most, his immediate willingness to take on her problems, his gentle care for both her and Lily, it had not been coincidence at all. "You came to Pine Ridge looking for me specifically," Emma whispered, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "Everything that happened, from the moment you appeared at that auction, was because of a promise you made to Tommy." Jake finally looked up, and Emma saw in his eyes a vulnerability she had never witnessed before. "I tried to find you immediately after the accident," he confessed. "But Carter made sure I was blacklisted and run out of the territory before I could locate you or fulfill my promise to Tommy. It took me months to work my way back, following rumors and leads until I finally learned you were in Pine Ridge." Emma stared at Jake in amazement, her mind reeling with this revelation. The wagon wheel that broke outside the courthouse, that was not coincidence either, was it? Jake shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth despite the seriousness of their conversation. "I had been watching the courthouse for days, waiting for the right opportunity to approach you. When I saw you were desperate enough to attend a labor auction, I knew it was my chance to honor Tommy's request." Emma felt a complex rush of emotions, gratitude, amazement, and something deeper that she was not yet ready to name. Everything about Jake's presence in their lives took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his promise to her dying husband. "But why did you not tell me the truth from the beginning?" Emma asked. "Why let me believe it was all coincidence?" Jake's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to explain his motivations. "Because I wanted you to choose me for who I was, not because of a debt to Tommy," he said finally. "I wanted to earn my place in your family through my own actions, not through obligation to a dead man's wishes." Emma rose carefully from the bed and moved to stand before Jake's chair, her hands coming to rest on his shoulders as she looked down into his face. "And you have," she said softly. "You have earned your place here in every possible way. But, Jake, there is something else you need to know." Jake looked up at her expectantly, and Emma took a deep breath before continuing. "Every night when Tommy was alive, he would place his hand on my belly and whisper the same words to our unborn child, the same phrase every time, like a blessing or a promise." Jake's eyes widened as he began to understand what Emma was about to reveal. "You are going to be loved beyond measure," Emma whispered. The words Tommy had spoken every night now carrying new meaning as she repeated them. That is what he said, every single night. "You are going to be loved beyond measure." Jake's face went completely still as Emma's words sank in, the color draining from his cheeks as he processed the impossible coincidence. "Those were his exact words," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. "The words he whispered to his unborn child every night before he died. How could you possibly know that phrase unless he told me to say it?" Jake finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "Unless he knew somehow that I would be the one to find you, to help raise his child." Emma felt tears streaming down her face as the full magnitude of what had happened became clear. Tommy had not simply asked Jake to watch over his family. He had somehow known that Jake would become part of that family, would be present for moments Tommy himself would never see. "He told you more than just to find me," Emma said with growing certainty. "He told you exactly what to say to his child, gave you the words that would let me know that he was still watching over us somehow." Jake nodded slowly, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. His last coherent words were instructions about that phrase. He made me repeat it back to him 3 times to make sure I had it exactly right. He said it was important, that you would understand when you heard it. Emma sank to her knees beside Jake's chair, overwhelmed by the realization that every significant moment of the past months had been orchestrated not by chance, but by love that transcended death itself. Tommy had found a way to send her exactly the help she needed, exactly the partner who could fill the void his death had created. "He chose you for us," Emma whispered, taking Jake's hands in hers. Somehow, in those final moments, he saw who you really were and knew that you would love us the way he wanted us to be loved. Jake pulled Emma gently to her feet and then into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that spoke of months of suppressed emotion finally finding expression. "I have loved you both from the moment I saw you at that auction," he confessed. Against her hair. "Not because of my promise to Tommy, but because of who you are. You are the strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and Lily is the daughter I never thought I would have." Emma pulled back to look into Jake's face, seeing there not just the affection and respect she had grown accustomed to, but something deeper and more profound. "And I love you," she admitted, the words feeling both surprising and inevitable. Not as Tommy's replacement, but as Jake Morrison, the man who kept a dying stranger's promise and stayed to become the husband and father we needed. Their kiss was different from the respectful peck they had shared at their wedding ceremony. This was a declaration of genuine love, a recognition of the bond that had been growing between them since their first meeting, nurtured by shared challenges and deepened by mutual respect and care. When they finally broke apart, Emma felt as if the last piece of a complex puzzle had finally fallen into place. Their practical marriage had become something real and meaningful, their convenience. Arrangement transformed into genuine partnership by the mysterious workings of love that refused to be constrained by death. 2 weeks later, Emma went into labor during a soft spring rainstorm that seemed to bless their mountain valley with new growth and possibility. Jake held her hand through every contraction, whispering words of encouragement and strength, his presence providing exactly the support she needed to bring their child safely into the world. When baby Sarah finally arrived, healthy and perfect with Tommy's dark hair and Emma's blue eyes, Jake was the first to hold her after Emma, his large Hands cradled the tiny infant with infinite gentleness as he whispered the words Tommy had asked him to say. "You are going to be loved beyond measure, little one," Jake murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Your papa in heaven wanted you to know that, and your papa here on earth promises it will always be true." Emma watched through tears of joy. As Jake bonded with the daughter who carried Tommy's blood, but would know only Jake's love and guidance. Sarah would grow up knowing the story of how her birth father had loved her enough to ensure she would never lack for protection and care, and how her adopted father had loved her mother enough to honor a dying man's final request. As the years passed, the Morrison family thrived in ways that exceeded Emma's most optimistic dreams. The trial of Ben Carter resulted in significant compensation for the victims' families, providing financial security that allowed Jake to establish his own carpentry business. The homestead expanded and prospered under their joint management, becoming known throughout the territory for the quality of Jake's woodwork and the warmth of their hospitality. Lily grew into a confident young woman who remembered her birth father with love, but considered Jake her true papa in every way that mattered. Sarah developed into a spirited child who bore physical resemblance to Tommy, but inherited Jake's patient temperament and analytical mind. Both girls grew up knowing they were loved beyond measure, not just by their parents, but by a father they had never met, who had ensured their welfare even in his final moments. Emma often reflected on the mysterious ways that love could transcend death, bringing people together across impossible circumstances to create families that were stronger than any biological bond. Jake Morrison had come to them as a stranger, purchased at auction, but he had been transformed by love and purpose into exactly the husband and father their family needed. Sometimes, in quiet moments when the mountain wind whispered through the pines around their homestead, Emma could almost hear Tommy's voice carried on the breeze, approving of the family his sacrifice had helped to create. He had kept his promise to love them beyond measure by ensuring that love would continue through the man he had chosen to take his place. The wild mountain man that nobody else had wanted to hire had become the cornerstone of their happiness, proving that sometimes the most broken hearts, when brought together by love and circumstance, create something stronger and more beautiful than anything that was never broken at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.